I'm the Community Education and Volunteer Program Manager at La Casa de las Madres. La Casa de las Madres is an organization that started 39 years ago, and it started as a confidential shelter. It was the coalition of 10 women that decided that they needed to find a safe place to stay in case that in their relationships women were feeling abused and were not feeling safe. So they created this shelter, and actually since the program funding, our services have been expanding. And we have our community office now, a drop-in center that people can come anytime, and we can provide support on the different stages that they are on the process of healing. And we also have 2 crisis line numbers, a teen program, legal advocacy, and many other programs. So our crisis line number is 1-877-503-1850, and it's free and confidential services that everybody can access to.
Awesome. Thanks, Leah.
Thank you. My name is Zaki Afrin. I work with Maitri as Client Advocacy Manager. I have been with Maitri with the past about 8 years. Maitri is based in San Francisco Bay Area, and we provide domestic violence victim services for the South Asian community. Our helpline is the first point of entry for most of our clients. We have legal program. We have transitional housing. We also have a robust outreach program that does a lot of prevention work. I'd like to tell you more about my organization as we get into the conversation. I'm also a board member with the partnership.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Gabriela Villarreal. I'm with the California Immigrant Policy Center, and we are a nonprofit organization that works to advance inclusive public policies for all Californians. And we do this by legislative advocacy, providing technical assistance, and training to immigrant communities and advocates throughout the state of California. We are also in 3 different locations throughout the state: Sacramento, Oakland, and Los Angeles. And you can find out more about our work on our website, caimmigrant.org, or you can follow us on Twitter, #CalImmigrant.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. So I'd like to ask you first, when immigrant survivors of domestic violence are in an abusive relationship and they try to seek services, what is different in their experience? And, can you give us some examples as well? Like, for example, what barriers do they face?
So if we look at the way we describe domestic violence, we describe it as an escalating pattern of abuse when one person exerts power and control and maintains power and control over another person within an intimate relationship. That's the definition that we use at La Casa. And we see that when our clients are immigrant clients, they have many other layers and they have many other vulnerabilities that other clients don't have.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot of other ways how the abusers can exert and maintain that power and control, and other tactics that can be used as well. And it can look in a lot of different ways. We had clients recently that had problems with getting their immigration paperwork done because the abuser was not willing to go to court and was not willing to go to the immigration appointment, immigration interview. So that can be used. There's a lot of subtleties and there's a lot of ways how batterers can use immigration status as a way to threaten and intimidate a victim. And it's not something that is as tangible as other ways of abuse, like physical abuse. It could be more visible, but it's really very empowered. That it can be as powerful as physical abuse as well, and very a big way for the abuser to control and have that power over the victim. So those are the ways how we've seen it so far. I'm curious to know a little bit what are the ways that it comes up at your organizations as well.
So thank you, Laya. I think you have described it very well, what domestic violence may look like for an immigrant survivor. I'd like to add with that the complexities of language barrier.
Mm-hmm.
Many times, and it can start from the very first contact they can make with the outside world. First of all, they may not know that services can be available in their own language, where they can freely and confidentially share some abusive relationship that they are in. And then if the abuse reaches, or actually I would say falls into the criteria of the definition of domestic violence that the system recognizes, which is physical violence, then they get in touch with the police, and the language barrier can be compounded at that point. We have had situations where the police would ask the mother-in-law who's staying in the same house to interpret for the victim. And that doesn't really work most of the times. We have had situations where a 12-year-old child was asked to interpret for the mother, where the neighbor was asked to interpret for the survivor. So in those situations, a survivor, if they get discouraged the first time or multiple times this happens, then there is no guarantee they will ever reach out again. So that's one thing. And add to that the dependency on immigration, right? A lot of our clients in the San Francisco Bay Area that we work with are on H4 or F2 visas, which are dependent of a temporary worker. And these dependent visa holders, almost legally, they don't have any existence of their own. They cannot go out and work. They cannot have separate tax status, for example. They may not have the opportunity to study for, with financial aid or anything, because the spouse is having a very high income. So they are very much dependent on the goodwill of their spouse. So these are only the two things that they may face. And then the third thing is we are talking about a very diverse immigrant community, especially in California, right? So, and in the world, only 2/3 of the world's countries have recognized domestic violence as a crime. So if an immigrant survivor is coming from a place where there was no legal recourse for a domestic violence situation, they may not understand what rights they have. So that's why community education is a very big part of our outreach, where we try to reach out to the minority groups and try to educate them, or inform them rather, about what is there as their rights, what rights they have as survivors.
Yeah, especially if the abuser keeps telling them that they don't have rights.
Exactly.
Yes. I think both of you bring up some really important points that look at the structural issues and really unfair laws that we have in the United States that also create additional barriers for an individual to identify as a victim of crime, much less to seek help and become a survivor of crime. And specifically, our outdated and very unfair immigration laws have created a system in which survivors of domestic violence, particularly immigrant survivors of domestic violence, are very concerned about any interactions that they have with local law enforcement. A major concern is the growth of unjust deportation programs that seek to bring together a really unjust partnership of immigration agents and local law enforcement. And what that does to the community, particularly victims of crime and witnesses of crime, it silences them, because any interaction that an immigrant may have with local law enforcement could lead to deportation. And when we have a system, an immigration system, that creates silence within a community when they should be seeking help, really just continues to erode trust that people have with local law enforcement, and just that thought in a person's head of, yes, I want to call for help, I want to call for police, but does this mean that I might be at risk of being deported? Or my loved one, who I want to stop doing what he or she is doing, just by the fact that I'm calling for help, might put my partner at risk for deportation. And those are real serious consequences of permanent separation of families and loved ones that really doesn't get talked about as much in how our disproportionate and unfair immigration laws impact immigrant survivors of crime and domestic violence.
Thank you, Gabriella, for bringing out that point. Actually, this is an issue that we are continuously engaged in the conversation, because we see it goes to the heart of the trust between the legal system and the community members. And like I said, the first contact with the survivor may be very discouraging, and this is the second layer when they are getting all this information from the administration and from the system, that if you are undocumented and then you are getting deported for multiple reasons, then definitely that's another reason for them not to involve anybody when they need so much help.
There's so much fear, and we see that at the office all the time, especially with those clients who are immigrants. There's a lot of fear with about saying something because they don't know what's going to happen, and the experience that they've had with law enforcement in their countries can be so different that they don't know what's going to happen if they call the police, or if they get into some sort of legal process. It's going to be long. Are they going to be supported? Are they going to be able to get services or access to services? And if so, are those services just going to help them out with the first steps, which will be a restraining order, or is that help going to be carried through the whole process and be able to support and kind of accompany all the overwhelming process that it is to be to start a legal process around it? And then something else that we see a lot of the times as well at La Casa de las Madres is abusers threatening our clients that they're going to take the kids away, that they're going to be deported and the kids will end up being with them, or they're going to take the kids away from the victim. And actually that's something that it's a big threat, and it paralyzes a lot of our clients, but it's not as good as founded threat. It's not a threat that can become true as easy, because the way the court system will work, they don't look at who's the main provider on the house. A lot of times battlers say, well, I'm the person that has all the income, so they're going to give the kids to me. And that's not exactly how it works. The way it works is they look at who has been the main caregiver of that person, of that child. And most of the times, they'll try to give custody to both parents, which is good news and bad news. It's bad news because if you want to take somebody totally out of the list, totally out of custody, it's going to be very difficult. But it's good because this threat that they're going to take the kids away, it's not a threat that normally gets carried through. But our clients don't know that, so it's really important to educate, especially when you come from another country and the rights in your country were different, and everybody at home, every time at home they're telling you that you don't have any right, that if you reach out, you're going to be the one that it's going to be having bad consequences from doing it. So it's really important to let people know about the rights that they have, the resources that they have, and then making sure that once they have all the tools, they can make their own decisions and they can feel empowered to do so. Because I feel like sometimes we also tend to want to direct a little bit their own decisions when they're so lost. And it's really important that people can access to that information and then make their own decisions, having into consideration everything that can come up for them. So we always try to do that through community education and through case management and direct service. And one thing that we feel that it's really important is to go to those communities who are more vulnerable and do primary intervention, do that intervention that will prevent future violence from happening. And that can look in a lot of different ways. It could be talking about how to set boundaries, talking about gender roles, talking about the red flags, the early signs of abuse. We feel that we need to start conversations earlier on, and the sooner the better. Yeah.
So Laya, I just want to go back to what you said about the threat of taking the children away. So for many of our clients, we see that this threat has two different outcomes, right? If the abuser's immigration status is the only chance for the survivor to stay here, and for any reason, either she goes to the police or she decides to leave the abuse, then she might lose her immigration status in this country. And if she's not a victim of crime, for example, if there was no physical abuse, however, extreme controlling, extreme financial abuse and others, she may not qualify for any immigration benefit that is available out there. For example, U visa, which will only benefit people with physical abuse as now. And so in those situations, we see women in a very difficult moment where they cannot decide what is the right thing to do. If the children are US citizen, they cannot really take the children and leave for their home country. So it becomes even harder for them to leave. And then there is the threat of parental abduction. International parental abduction is a real issue for us in our organization. It's because the US administration, they don't have any understanding with many governments that what happens if there is an international parental abduction, if both parents are holding two different citizenships, then what happens? Where does the child go? And if the child is traveling to one country, which country's court will have the final say, right? So there are multiple layers that the abuser can take advantage of this issue with children. And it's very unfortunate that so far we have been trying very hard to work with some of our abduction situations that we face, but it's usually there is no win-win situation in these cases.
Thank you for all of that rich discussion. I'm also curious, you outlined some of the barriers that immigrant survivors are facing, specifically language barriers, legal barriers. Are there any particular examples you can give of maybe survivors that you've worked with, or things you've seen specifically when working with clients? And I guess speaking also to the importance of the work you're doing in providing culturally relevant services, talking about how that has been helpful.
We've seen it like as a lot of isolation,
Mm-hmm.
and it goes both ways. Isolation from the mother that doesn't let our client see her community, speak her language, and put her in a position where she might not be able to access to legal jobs here because they don't let them learn English. So then they're exposing them to do jobs that are under the table, and that creates a lot of fear as well of what's going to happen if it's found out that I'm working illegally. So it's kind of like sometimes with some clients we see a little bit of a dead end where we have to become really creative with how we're going to manage that, or a lot of times if they cannot work and the partner is giving them an allowance, and it's a really specific amount of money that they're giving them, and they're controlling exactly how to spend it, so they might not have money to take a bus to go to an interview, because then they have to explain what happened, why did you take the bus from here to here. So we had one client that brainstormed this really creative and genius idea of every time that she would go to the supermarket, she would ask the people on the line, can I pay this and you give me the cash, so that she could get cash, and kind of brainstorming different ways, because otherwise if she would get it from the credit card, the abuser would see that she had expense. So there's a lot of things that we have to come up with, and a lot of things that we have to brainstorm, and sometimes it can look really subtle. All the different actions can look really subtle, but they're really, they become a big problem for survivors to continue working towards ending that relationship or getting to a better place. And another one that I wanted to mention that happened not a long time ago as well, it's self-isolation. Talking about isolation, it's not just the abuser isolating the victim, but if the victim reaches out for help, and especially in some immigrant communities where it's not well seen, the separation of the family, there might be some cultural beliefs, some religion beliefs that can make a victim feel guilty a lot of times about leaving the family or separating from the relationship. So a lot of times we see how our clients self-isolate themselves from their community of support, and then it's really hard to get out of the situation and really walk towards the steps that are needed for the change.
Right. So I agree with what you said. These are the same issues that we face. I would add with that, what happens when, let's say, the first barrier there, somehow they overcome, they reach out to you or me or other culturally formed organizations, able to speak their language and all. When they go to the courthouse, because of drastic funding cuts, right now the courts, some of the courts are providing interpreters only for restraining orders, right? And restraining orders, a lot of times we have seen our clients don't want to take a restraining order. What if it affects his job? And if he doesn't have a job, he can't provide support for me and my children. So they would say, I don't want to go through a restraining order, I just want to be separated, right? And in those situations, the court will not provide them any interpreters. So many times we will go out to the community, we do active training and train people as interpreters from different languages. However, we are a very small agency and our capacity is very limited. We may be able to provide people who are in Santa Clara County or in Alameda County, at the most San Francisco, right? But beyond that, this is happening throughout California, throughout the US, that court interpreters are not being available, and which is really very, very important for helping any immigrant survivors. The other thing is there are funding cuts for even court reporters who takes detailed notes of what is happening. So if the court reporters are not there and there is no minutes of what the judge is deciding, many times you hear the judge and that's your point of reference, and a lot of things can get lost in that. And we have found out that because our client was not able to understand or follow, and the other party had an attorney, they have missed out on so many things that the judge had actually asked to be put in the in their interactions. So these kind of things are really having even additional negative effects on the immigrant survivors. So the funding has been a very big concern for all of us in the advocates community.
I think you bring up a great point about due process and having a fair day in court.
Right.
Some of these systemic issues related to budget cuts of interpreters, court reporters, and access to counsel is so critical to help a survivor advance his or her case. But what we've seen also in California is, because of unjust deportation policies, a very similar pattern has developed where a person might be calling the police for help during a situation. The police show up, and due to just mandates, are required to arrest both individuals engaged in the dispute. And what this does for survivors of domestic violence who are immigrants, it puts them at risk for not only having an arrest record, but everyone who gets arrested gets their fingerprints checked, and those fingerprints are checked against federal immigration databases. And that puts both parties at risk of potentially being detained and deported. So these programs have serious consequences and are serious concerns for immigrant communities of how can we make sure that our community is safe when, again, any interaction could potentially lead to an arrest and perhaps even deportation, and what that does that mean for not just the community but also the family that may want to try to stay together.
So Gabriela, I have a question for you. Do you see a lot of selective enforcement of this, the PEP or civil detainer, like targeting one specific community?
Certainly the issue of profiling based on race or ethnicity is a concern for communities around the country, regardless of race and ethnicity. But we have seen, because of these collaborations between local law enforcement and federal immigration, that quite frankly, that anybody, again, who encounters local law enforcement is potentially at risk for deportation. So in addition to the calls that there have been for more transformative accountability of local law enforcement, which is correct in terms of preventing profiling, we also need to take a look at how this extends unjustly to the immigration system and puts immigrant communities at risk. And this is an issue that impacts undocumented immigrants, but also, as you have mentioned, individuals who are here on a family immigrant visa can affect people with deferred action or temporary protective status. And also, even if the person who's calling for help is a U.S. citizen, their loved one who may be abusive may be undocumented. And so we have to think as well about the concerns that the person who is calling for help may have about putting their loved one who is abusing them, and they want to have that stop, but putting that person at risk of being deported as well. And they may be relying on that person for financial assistance and care of their children. So there are so many other elements that come into play, and just these detention policies and deportation programs have really complicated an already emotional, difficult to navigate system.
Yes, definitely. We've also seen how a lot of times clients don't want to report incidences that have happened because they are aware that they're already part of a marginalized group, and they don't want to put more stigma into that marginalized group. So that's something that also comes to play, and we've seen happening sometimes.
In reference to marginalized groups that you're mentioning, there are records that calls have gone down when one specific community is targeted for whatever reason, and there's a lot of profiling going on. You may remember in 2001, after the Twin Tower attack, there were 28 countries that were singled out, and all males between the ages of, I believe, 16 and 40 needed to register. So mostly those countries were Muslim populated countries, and the domestic violence organizations have reported drastic decrease in Muslim women calling for help, because once you marginalize a community, it's much harder for them to come.
Thank you. And you guys have been talking about really systemic barriers for immigrant survivors of domestic violence. And I want to know, what can we do on a really broad systemic level to make the treatment of immigrant survivors more equitable?
That's quite a question. Great question.
It's a huge question.
I think some of the efforts that both of your organizations as well as others that put at the core the fact that we all have inherent dignity and respect, and in the United States that in particular we are afforded certain rights that particularly for victims of crime, regardless of immigration status, extend to you. And so the organizing and the education of clients and survivors, as well as the public, is so key to getting the word out about what the problem is, but the fact that people do have rights. So, I'm always very hopeful that with the community organizing and education of existing rights and policies, that we can continue to advance this conversation and bring awareness to this issue.
So with this, I'd like to add few specific policy proposals that we have been really engaged in conversations with different groups. There has been a trend to cultural stereotyping Asian women, and there are laws that actually are selectively enforced for Asian women when it's supposed to be for everybody. I'll give you an example. In Indiana, in 2009, there was a law that was passed against feticide, and so far there are only 2 women who have been charged and sentenced with that. One was an Asian Chinese woman who actually tried to commit suicide and ended up losing her baby. She had a miscarriage. And the other one is pretty recent. She lost her child and went to the hospital seeking help and ended up getting arrested. Now she's looking at 41-year prison sentence. So you wonder, in a state where only 1% of the population is Asian, this law only applied to Asian women, right? And then there is another law that was passed in 8 different states after a failed attempt at passing it at the federal level. It's called the Prenda, Prenatal Discrimination Act, Non-Discrimination Act, which is, the law is framed in a way that as if it's to protect the girl children about to be born, and the premise is that in Asia there is a strong preference for male children, so there is abortions when the couple will find out the sex of the unborn child, and solely based on that premise and no specific or reliable research, 8 states have passed this anti-sex selective abortion ban, which is actually a way of very much culturally stereotyping and targeting Asian women. And then, so in California, that law has been coming up every few years. Latest, it came up last February, but obviously it didn't pass. So we are actually trying to see if the cities would come forward on their own and pass a resolution condemning and opposing such trends. San Francisco City has already passed that resolution, and we are working to see if we can make this ask a little bigger and people will pitch in. Because we have realized we are in the area for the 25 years that only providing direct services is not enough. Unless we get involved in policy that specifically affects the immigrant community, we are not able to provide holistic support for our community members. So definitely, together with the comprehensive immigration reform and letting go of the whole civil detainer or measures, passing new laws for benefiting victims of crime and not defining crime only by physical abuse, because we don't define domestic violence only as physical abuse. Then why not offer the immigration benefits to the others who are not being abused physically, right? So there are a lot of work that needs to be done, and hopefully we'll get there sometime.
You got it. I feel like community education and community awareness is the key to prevent future violence by redefining those perceptions that we have of domestic violence. And we need to do that with vulnerable populations, and we need to do that with the whole community, and especially those people that interact with potential victims. And we always try to teach law enforcers, people that work on medical facilities, because they might encounter a lot of people that could benefit from this information, people that work in schools, people that work in education, judges. It's really important that the court system is also aware about it and knows what domestic violence is and isn't, the key dynamics, the cycle, how does it look like, the patterns, the myths. And it's really important that all the community can become well informed, so that there's not more people that are bystanders and are just watching it from outside, and that we all understand that this is not a private matter. It happens so often. 1 out of 3 people in the United States will experience domestic violence at some point of their lives. So that's, at this point, such a huge number that I call it the good news and bad news. It's bad news because it's such a widespread epidemic, but it's good news because there's no way how we can say this is something that has nothing to do with me. It has to do with all of us at this point because it's a public health concern. So it's really important that we all get ourselves informed about it, and get ourselves informed in some community action tips that we can do to help out survivors and to prevent future violence by educating the younger ones. Yeah.
Thank you. And it's just about 2 o'clock, so that concludes our Periscope chat. I really want to say thank you to each of our panelists. I think we had a wonderful conversation, and we will be posting this video recording throughout our social media. So if your friends or family or colleagues missed it, they'll be able to watch it. Thank you again.